Chapter 1. The Vanishing of Fred Hollenbeck. Fred Hollenbeck wasn't your average tinkerer. Sure, he wore oil-stained coveralls and had a beard that could spark static if you rubbed a balloon near it, but under that crusty exterior was a mind like no other. Years of bouncing between naval acoustics, bush piloting over jagged Canadian wilderness, long-haul trucking, welding in machine shops, and guarding warehouses filled with expired pharmaceuticals had given him something more valuable than money or fame, an obsessive curiosity that refused to die. His workshop was chaos incarnate. Tools mingled with half-dissected radios. Sketches lined the walls, frenzied scribbles of magnetic flux equations, and coffee-stained napkin calculations taped beside faded, "Don't feed the gremlins" signs. The centerpiece of it all was parked crookedly under a tarp that smelled faintly of WD-40 and regret. The aluminum boat. It hadn't touched water in over a decade. Fred had repurposed it as the body for his grand idea, an anti-gravity craft, cobbled together with the elegance of a mad genius. On its underside, 3 5-foot circular rings mounted in a triangular configuration. Each ring was fitted with 36 superconducting electromagnets cooled by a 20-pound fire extinguisher filled with CO2. Battery banks sat on either side of the pilot's seat, rigged for balance and wired into a hand-built controller that would let Fred manipulate the current and voltage coursing through each ring. Now, today was the day. With the air thick with hope and damp sawdust, Fred lowered himself into the boat. His eyes scanned the workshop like a conductor ready for his symphony. He flicked the switches with deliberate confidence. CO2 hissed through the coolant lines, the magnets began to hum, and the controller warmed in his calloused hands. He nudged the power. Nothing. He jammed the slider to maximum. Suddenly, everything bent. The light folded. A soft snap rippled through the air like reality had forgotten how to hold itself together. Then Fred vanished. No flash, no bang, just gone. Chapter 2. Breadcrumbs through the canopy. Fred stood for a long while, chin tilted, eyes narrowed, trying to reconcile the dreams with the trees. His bones ached in that familiar way, the kind of ache that had nothing to do with arthritis and everything to do with instinct. Something was off. The forest didn't just look foreign. It felt too quiet, too curated, like someone had programmed the wilderness but hadn't debugged it. He scanned the horizon. No power lines, no distant hum of a highway, just birdsong that sounded like it might be looped through a speaker hidden in a hollow tree. Fred sniffed. Damp earth, the musk of decomposing leaves, faint wafts of pine and fungus. Definitely not city air. The canopy rose high above him, latticed with thick-limbed deciduous trees he couldn't name, despite years of bush piloting over every biome Alberta had to offer. No landmarks, no contrails in the sky, just him and the shadows. He marked the nearest tree with a cautious X using his pocket knife, like a breadcrumb in this botanical maze. The bark bled a dark sap, not pine, not birch. It smelled almost minty. Fred's eyebrows did that slow, skeptical lift that usually preceded trouble. Before he set off, he checked his phone again, almost out of reflex. Still charged. Still lonely. No signal, no networks, just his compass app blinking like a digital prayer. South it was. He trudged forward, each step crunching softly in the underbrush. Time stretched elastic. The light shifted eerily overhead, dappling the ground in patterns that never quite repeated. Birds chirped and trilled with excessive enthusiasm, and more than once he thought he heard what sounded like whispers. Words in a language made entirely of consonants, just out of reach. Could have been dehydration, or maybe just the lingering buzz of whatever magnetic madness had folded him into this place. After 2 hours, he stumbled upon something strange. Clearing, circular, manicured. At its center, a single wooden post about chest high, topped with a small brass compass that pointed northwest, no matter which direction he turned. Fred frowned. Well, that's new. He sat by the post, took a sip of water, and rationed a single square of chocolate. His stomach complained like an old diesel engine left to idle. Around him, the wind picked up for exactly 3 minutes, then stopped, as if following a schedule. He looked closer at the post and noticed faint carvings spiraling around it. Symbols he didn't recognize. Not letters. Not runes. They shimmered faintly in the sun like fish scales. Fred reached out. The moment his fingers touched the compass, the ground beneath him gave a low thrum, and the trees bent inward like bowing dancers. The compass needle vibrated, and then spun wildly, faster and faster, until it stopped dead, pointing straight down. Fred whispered, "Well, that's unsettling." Chapter 3. The River That Didn't Belong. Fred stood at the edge of the hedge, staring slack-jawed at the river that shouldn't be there. It stretched impossibly wide, like someone had grafted a freshwater ocean into the middle of the forest. The water shimmered an unnatural blue-green, almost too vibrant, too clean. No debris, no algae, not even a ripple from wind, just glassy silence. Something prickled beneath his skin. He crept toward the bank, each step slow and deliberate. His boots squished slightly in the loamy soil, which smelled faintly of cinnamon, not mud. The air was cooler here, charged like it had weight. The river gave off a low hum, not loud, but constant, like a distant generator barely audible through thick walls. Fred dropped to one knee and dipped a finger cautiously into the current. The moment his skin made contact, the hum stopped. The water rippled outward once, then stilled. Fred yanked his hand back and examined it. Fine. Not even wet. He sniffed it. No smell. No residue. It was as if the water had refused to touch him. Behind him, the forest sighed. A breeze passing through the trees in what sounded eerily like laughter. Fred turned and scanned the treetops. Nothing. Just branches swaying rhythmically, too synchronized, like they were part of a rehearsal. He checked his phone. Battery still strong. Compass still pointing south. But he was no longer sure south meant anything here. That's when he spotted something across the river. Not a person. A structure. Low, wide, and organic-looking. It shimmered like stone in the sun, yet pulsed gently, like a living creature holding its breath. No windows, no doors, just ridges and arches, like someone carved architecture into a whale's ribcage. Fred squinted. There were more posts, like the ones from the clearings, but these ones glowed faintly purple and seemed to bob slightly, as if afloat. There was no bridge, just the river. Fred eyed the surface again. Then his boat, the aluminum craft still nestled in the clearing behind him like an obedient retriever waiting for command. It would be heavy to drag, but maybe it could float again. Maybe that's what it was meant to do here. Or maybe the river would eat it whole. Fred didn't know what was guiding him. Logic had long since packed up and left. But something deeper stirred in his gut. Compulsion. A pull. Like the magnets were still humming in his bones. He walked back to the boat and began to drag. The trees watched. Chapter 4. The Hollow Night. Fred dragged the battered aluminum boat across terrain that seemed to resist him with every step. Roots snagged his boots, branches whipped at his arms, and the underbrush clawed at his ankles like it was trying to keep him from the water's edge. By the time the last amber rays of the sun dissolved behind the trees, he'd only made it halfway. There would be no crossing tonight. He found a spot nestled between two mossy boulders and flipped the boat upside down, sheltering beneath its hull like a hermit crab taking cover. The air was warm, almost too warm for deep forest, but merciful. A steady 23 degrees Celsius with a breeze that smelled faintly sweet, like honey or wildflowers or something he couldn't quite name. Familiar and foreign all at once. His fire came alive after a few coaxing sparks from the flint he'd packed. Flames licked up the dry wood, casting dancing shadows on the sides of the overturned boat and the trunks beyond. The forest responded. There were noises, tapping, churring, the occasional rustle that made Fred clutch his flashlight tighter. Yet nothing approached, and the fire kept its vigil. He wasn't hungry, not even a pang. His stomach, once knotted with need, was oddly settled. He'd refilled his water bottle at the river, half expecting it to taste metallic or bitter, but it was perfectly clear, perfectly tasteless, like it had never touched soil or sky. Fred leaned back, his head cradled by his pack, and listened to the forest's lullaby. He'd camped dozens of times in his life, but never in a place like this. This forest didn't feel old, it felt ancient. Not in years, but in presence. Like it had always been waiting. For him, or something else. Sleep came without warning. He woke before the light, around 6 a.m., according to his phone, which still ticked along despite having no signal. Battery at 50%. Still enough. The air was still warm, still sweet. The fire had long since died, but he hadn't been cold. No dew clung to the leaves. No chill settled into his bones. It was like the forest had patted his rest, cradled him. He sat up slowly and listened. Not a single bird. Not a single insect. Not even the hum of water nearby. Just silence. And then, a single leaf detached from a tree and floated down, spiraling gently like it was trying not to disturb anything. Fred took it as a signal. Time to move again. Chapter 5, The Refit and the Reach. Fred hadn't patched a boat since his Navy days, and even then, it was someone else's job. But necessity had a way of sharpening old memories. The aluminum hull of the boat looked pitiful, pockmarked from the haphazard installation of superconducting rings, scarred by Fred's ambition. Still, it was the only vessel he had, and he wasn't about to let a few holes keep him stranded in whatever forest this was. He set to work immediately. By day he labored, hunched over the hull like a sculptor correcting his own folly. With his Swiss Army knife and the patience born of 1,000 mechanical failures over the years, he unscrewed each magnet ring one by one, working the knife's tiny Phillips head like it was holy. His fingers cramped, his back protested, and the forest offered no encouragement. Just the occasional rustle, as if nature was watching with mild curiosity. When the last magnet came off, Fred examined the bottom. At least 14 holes stared back at him. He gathered pine pitch from wounded trees, heating and kneading it into crude plugs. Mixed with bits of bark and pressure from a flat stone, it hardened surprisingly well. It wouldn't last forever, but Fred didn't need forever. He needed 150 meters. The next morning, he turned his attention to propulsion. No paddles? No problem. Fred fished out 2 long, fallen limbs from the forest floor, mostly straight, heavy enough to hold shape. He shaved them down with his knife, carved handles, even notched the ends for grip against the water. They looked less like oars and more like medieval weapons, but they'd do. By the third sunrise, Fred was ready. The boat sat at the river's edge like a relic of another time, glinting silver in the soft dawn light. The hull bobbed ever so slightly, a good sign. He loaded his essentials. Phone at 44% battery, water bottle full, pocket knife secured, hoodie tucked behind his seat. He pushed off. To his relief, the boat floated. It creaked, hissed, and leaked slightly along one seam, but nothing that couldn't be bailed out with a hollowed gourd he'd fashioned overnight. The river's current was sluggish, almost contemplative. Fred dipped the oars into its glassy surface and rowed, slowly at first, testing the water's temperament. Each stroke felt surreal. The river didn't push back like it should. The water parted as if yielding to Fred, almost guiding him forward. Ripples trailed the boat like silver threads, and the hum, the strange low vibration he'd felt before, returned. Louder now, resonant. It pulsed through the hull, up his spine, into his jaw. Halfway across, Fred paused to catch his breath. He turned to glance back. His forest camp was still there, shadowed and quiet. But now he saw something he hadn't before. Faint lights blinking among the trees. Not fireflies, not stars. Signals. He squinted forward. The structure on the other bank, the whalebone architecture, loomed larger now. It was beautiful and bizarre, like a dream half remembered. Its surface shimmered and folded like skin over bone. Fred kept rowing. The humming deepened, then stopped. As the boat touched the far bank, the river stilled completely. Fred set foot on the foreign shore with damp shoes and wide eyes. Whatever waited beyond was not made for men like him. But Fred Hollenbeck wasn't just a man. He was a man with a lifetime of questions. And he was ready for answers. Chapter 6. Enter the structure. Fred stepped onto the shore, the sand beneath his boots strangely warm and fine, almost metallic. Before him loomed the structure, tall, silent, and unlike anything he'd ever seen. No doors, no windows in the traditional sense, but a narrow vertical opening stood at its center, flanked by what might have been window-like recesses. The building gave no sign of life, no movement, no sound. Just stillness. Cautiously, Fred approached and stepped through the doorway. Inside, the space was sparsely furnished, the decor minimal and alien. To his left sat something that resembled a chair, sleek, curved, and hovering just slightly above the floor. It seemed to pulse faintly, as if aware of his presence. Beyond it, the room was empty. To the right, Fred found what could only be described as a kitchen. A shallow depression in the counter resembled a sink, and above it, a pipe arched like a swan's neck. As Fred passed his hand beneath it, warm water began to flow automatically. Shelves lined the walls, filled with unfamiliar objects and containers. A strange table stood near the doorway, its surface rippling slightly as if reacting to the ambient air. At the far end of the room, another doorway led to a second chamber. Here, along the back wall, was a large rectangular platform, perhaps a bed. Its surface shimmered with a soft, gel-like texture. Fred sat down, then lay back, and the material shifted to cradle his body perfectly. It was unnervingly comfortable. He hadn't realized how exhausted he was. Within moments, his eyes grew heavy, and the quiet hum of the structure lulled him into sleep. Chapter 7. The Fruit of the Unseen. Fred blinked against the pale afternoon sun, rubbing the sleep from his eyes like a man waking from hibernation. The bed, if it could be called that, had molded to him not just in shape but in feeling. It didn't have a blanket, didn't need one. It had simply held him, soothed something restless inside him, like it had taken the edge off his soul. Now he was hungry. No gentle peace or ethereal calm could override an empty stomach. Not for long. His water bottle was still half full, but the chocolate bar was long gone, and the last thing he'd eaten was over 36 hours ago. Fred was no stranger to hunger, but this place felt like it didn't want him to go hungry. He stepped outside the pale coral structure, and there it was. A basket, woven from reeds he didn't recognize, shaped like an upside-down spiral and sitting precisely where Fred would step. Inside it, fruit. Not quite apples, not quite pears. Somewhere between the two, their skin an iridescent blend of violet and green, like bruised light caught in velvet. He counted 8. Fred hesitated. It was too convenient, too deliberate. But after everything he'd seen, the humming architecture, the faucet responding to his movement, the forest keeping its distance, he figured the basket was no coincidence. Someone or something had left it there, and somehow he knew it was safe. He picked up one of the fruits and examined it. No stem, no pit, no blemishes. He sniffed sweet, citrusy with a hint of vanilla. He took a bite. Instant warmth flooded his chest. The taste was unlike anything Fred had ever known. Part tangy, part creamy, like mango married to moonlight. He ate another, and another. He stopped at 4, full enough but not stuffed. That's when the lights flickered again behind the tree line. They weren't random anymore. They pulsed in rhythm. They matched the beat he'd heard inside the structure, slow and steady, like the world had a heartbeat and now Fred was inside it. The doorway behind him gave off a single chime. Not from any speaker, but from itself, from the material, like bone ringing faintly. Fred turned slowly. There was a new doorway inside, one that hadn't been there before. It glowed softly, beckoning. Fred gathered the rest of the fruit, slid it into his hoodie's front pouch, and walked back inside. Chapter 8. The Keeper of the Quiet Pulse. The figure in the doorway was tall, far taller than Fred, its body tapering like smoke held briefly in the shape of a person. No face, no limbs in the human sense, just outline and presence, and an inner luminescence like moonlight filtered through water. It didn't move with steps. It simply hovered, its edges rippling softly like chiffon caught in a breeze. Fred stared for a long moment, No words were spoken. There was no telepathic transmission, no sudden download of alien truths. Just an overwhelming calm, like the air had turned into velvet. It was the kind of peace Fred hadn't felt since childhood. Lying on a cabin floor, hearing distant waves lick the dock through cracked windows. The figure beckoned without gesture, without sound. Fred stepped forward. The doorway widened as he approached, stretching fluidly to accommodate him. Inside, the new chamber was unlike the others. This room breathed, literally. The walls expanded and contracted slowly, rhythmically. That thumping pulse was stronger now, no longer ambient but centered directly beneath his feet. As he crossed the threshold, something shifted. The figure followed, hovering at a respectful distance. Fred turned slightly to glance at it, and for the first time he felt something. Not words, but memory, shared. It washed over him like a tide. A distant world now gone. A technology built to preserve its memory. A language that existed in sensation, not sound. Fred gasped, not from fear but from understanding. This place wasn't just a refuge. It was an archive. The building, the organic structure, had once belonged to a race that knew gravity not as force, but as emotion. They had encoded their stories into vibration, into architecture, into fruit that whispered history into the stomach of its eater. Fred had been chosen not randomly. He had come seeking, and they had listened. The figure glided forward and touched Fred's shoulder. Barely. He felt it like warmth, like memory touching skin. And somewhere beneath the floor, a new sound stirred. Not a hum, not a heartbeat. A door. Chapter 9. The envoy at the core. Fred stepped past the threshold into the first chamber. A vast, cathedral-like hall that hummed with quiet precision. The walls were layered in panels that pulsed like digital tide pools, displaying glyphs that blinked in alien cadence. Consoles lined the perimeter, each attended by tall, slender figures whose movements were graceful, almost ritualistic. Their limbs dissolved into flowing extensions of light as they manipulated interfaces that responded to thought rather than touch. This place was not chaotic. It was orchestral. Soundless coordination rippled through the room as if each figure were a musician in a living symphony of data. Tubes of glowing fluid rose and fell in rhythm with invisible calculations. One console projected a three-dimensional map of a spiral galaxy, its arms adjusting in real time. Another emitted low pulses that formed hovering lattices of unknown particles, vibrating slightly in Fred's presence. The figure who had guided him did not linger. It moved forward deliberately, and Fred followed. His eyes wide with awe but his mind strangely calm. The atmosphere was not oppressive but welcoming, as though every piece of technology had been tuned to soothe rather than impress. At the far end of the chamber stood a portal. Circular, rimmed in bronze-like alloy that reacted to Fred's proximity with a subtle change in tone. They passed through it together and entered the dome. It was staggering. The ceiling above shimmered like a living sky, constellations swirling slowly in intimate choreography with Fred's breath. The scale was monumental, but it didn't overwhelm, it embraced. The floor beneath him resonated, giving his steps a faint echo that felt like he was walking through memory. And there, in the center, stood the differently garbed figure. Chapter 10. The Chosen Thread. Fred sat quietly within the dome, enveloped in light and time. No words were spoken. There were no lips, no vocal cords. But the meaning flowed like ink into parchment. Not pushed, not parsed, simply known. The tall figure, the envoy, stood before Fred on a platform of slow-turning rings, each one inscribed with swirling patterns that mimicked the surface of the structure outside. Fred watched the rings move, feeling his mind move with them. And then came the knowing. They had observed humanity for more than 1,000 years. Long before satellites blinked across the sky, long before engines rumbled and wires stretched across continents. They had watched from the folds, obscured, unreadable, tracking choices, instincts, fears, and dreams. And they had watched Fred, not for fame or genius, but for something quieter. Fred had shown pattern, balance, a strange willingness to question the shape of things, even when there were no answers. From childhood inventions made of bent spoons and batteries, to that quiet moment at 19 when he tried to save a raccoon stranded on a frozen power line, to the invention in his workshop that pierced a hole between worlds. Fred had been a thread. And now that thread was chosen. The envoy unfolded one arm, long, translucent, and the room responded. Symbols appeared in the air like steam rising from warm breath on glass. Fred didn't read them. He absorbed. The world will turn soon. Not all will turn with it. The voices need a bridge. You are that bridge. Fred blinked slowly. His hands felt heavy in his lap. Not with fear, with gravity. Purpose now had mass. He saw flashes, not visions, not hallucinations, but emotional echoes. A city flooded not by water, but by confusion. A great crowd, chanting in dozens of languages at once. A child staring at a screen, waiting for someone to explain. And then he saw himself, older, standing atop a cliff, speaking not with power, but with understanding. He didn't know what he was saying, but everyone listened. The light in the dome pulsed once, gently. The consultation was complete. Fred would stay one more night. Tomorrow, the real journey would begin. Chapter 11. The Stillness Curriculum. Fred's training began not with instruction, but with silence. For the first 33 days, the tall beings didn't speak. They didn't move in ways that implied urgency or agenda. Fred was shown to a round room with no edges, no corners, just gentle curves and living light. Here, time didn't pass as hours. Pulsed. The walls responded to mood, not touch, and Fred's own heartbeat became a tuning fork. He was taught to listen, not with ears, but with attention. Each morning, he sat in meditation beside a floating orb that reflected only what he truly believed. When Fred was impatient, it flickered wildly. When he focused, the orb stilled, and his thoughts became visible, vivid holograms swirling around him like ink in water. His trainers watched, not judging, but aligning. He learned emotional discipline, how to control pulse and breath until not even a whisper of tension remained. He learned psychic calibration, concentrating on fields of vibrating crystal nodes, tuning them with thought alone until the room sang back at him. He began to glimpse echoes of others, other minds brushing past his own. Not invasive, just neighboring thoughts in the great mental meadow. Later, he was invited to walk barefoot through a forest of gravity-bending trees. Each step altered his weight. Fred learned to move without disturbing space itself. It was like dancing with reality. He grew leaner, more limber, not younger but more elemental. Chapter 12. The Folding Mind. By his second year, Fred had grown into the pattern. No longer a visitor, he was now immersed. His psychic training deepened. The beings taught him through visual language. Symbols folded into layered light. Entire concepts poured into his mind like complex chords. Some lessons took days to unravel. Others struck instantly, like lightning burning truth into bone. He learned psychokinetic control, manipulating physical systems with awareness alone. Moving stones through concentration, sensing magnetic pulses in nearby minerals, even nudging time slightly. A second's delay here, a moment's fast forward there. Field merging, entering communion with the world around him. Fred could become emotionally invisible, merging so completely with the planet's rhythms that even animals no longer noticed him. Presence amplification, increasing his psychic footprint so that his thoughts could guide others from afar. One exercise had him thinking soothing thoughts while walking through a storm. The storm dimmed. The dome became his temple, the forest his crucible. And above all, the beings were his silent choir, always watching, always knowing when to push, when to step back. On his final morning, the sky blinked. Literally, a constellation rearranged itself in the shape of a wave. Fred understood. The world Earth was ready to bend. And he, at 70 years old, was ready to return. Fred stood beneath the shifting sky, no longer a visitor, no longer a question. He was the thread, and tomorrow the weave would begin. End of episode 1. One thread pulled, 3 more to unravel.